Hello friends and welcome back to my channel. I know my reading wrap up is a little late this month, but I'm ready to dive in, so I hope you are too. So I am sort of like teetering on the edge of a reading slump at the moment. I'm sort of like in denial, refusing to accept it. I'm still powering through as best I can, but I definitely did not read as much this month as I normally do. Part of me didn't want to do a reading wrap up this month because I feel like I haven't read enough, but that is some perfectionistic bullshit talking. I still read 6 books. 6 books is still a good effort, and they are 6 books worth talking about, so that's exactly what we're gonna do. My average star rating was 3.75. I sort of read a few things that I didn't mind, that I sort of had mixed feelings about, but I didn't read anything that I particularly dislike or hated. For this video, I'm not gonna divide things into half stars. I'm just gonna talk about the whole star ratings as we go through our rankings. So let's start with the 3 and 3.5 star books. Firstly is Winter in Sokcho, which does have a very, very cool cover. I know everyone's obsessed with this cover at the moment. This was a very short read. I think the shortest book that I read this month. It was very quick to get through. And I actually really quite enjoyed the writing style. Sokcho is a small town on the border or near the border of South Korea and North Korea. And basically we meet a young woman who's sort of at a bit of a crossroads in her life, at a bit of a weird point. She's working at an inn or a hotel in this town of Sokcho. She does have a boyfriend, but he's sort of like, they're long distance, he's working away. They plan to get married at some point, but they don't really seem like they're connecting super well. We also meet the main character's mother, and we find out that like her mother is Korean, but her father, who she's never met, is French. And basically a French gentleman comes to stay at the inn. They sort of develop a bit of a weird friendship, like she's interested in his work. He's like an artist. Clearly I didn't love this book. I really enjoyed the writing, like I said. I felt like it really captured this like small wintry town atmosphere really well. It was really easy to read and very accessible, but at the same time I still felt like the setting was evoked really well. What I think let this down to me was like the characters themselves didn't feel particularly compelling or interesting, and I didn't find the relationships that developed, like the dynamics, I didn't find them compelling at all. I didn't find them interesting. I know that the author was like creating tension, and like I could tell that there was tension between characters. I didn't care enough about the characters to care about the tension, so I didn't feel it. While I was reading this, it sort of reminded me of like a budget indie film where like the shots of the scenery are really beautiful, and like there's really stunning like moments with like intimate moments between characters that we get really pretty, like visually pretty shots to look at. But often with those indie films, what else do we get? Like a sort of generic, not like other girls girl who doesn't have much of a personality of her own. I guess in the end it all just felt a bit cliche, even if it did have a beautiful setting. So I don't know. I don't want to be mean to this book, because like overall I enjoyed the experience of reading it, because I found the writing quite pretty and it was just very easy to read. It's just not a book that I will think about beyond this month. And I don't particularly care about. I don't even remember how it ended because I just wasn't invested. Next up we have The Walking Man by Jiro Taniguchi. This is my second Taniguchi that I've read. Last year I read Furari, which was one of my favorite books of the year. I adored it. And I actually read Furari in around the same sort of like emotional period. Like last year I read it when I was sort of like on the edge of a reading slump and just sort of struggling with motivation and inspiration to read. I read that book and I just found it so like subtle and moving and beautiful that I was like inspired, and then I fell back in love with reading. I was hoping this book would do the same, but alas, it did not. There's actually a lot of comparisons between this and Furari, and I knew that going in. Like obviously we center like sort of like a middle-aged man as our main focus, and we just watch him in his everyday life, and he enjoys, especially as he goes on little like small adventures, like very, very small adventures, just walking around his local area. And as with Furari, we sort of focus in on really, really small, seemingly mundane things, but the main character like sees them in an elevated way that brings a level of charm and magic to the story and to our experience as a reader. The art is stunning, stunning. 5 stars for the art, no question. I especially love how we have these sort of small frames of like really small detail with the character, and then you'll turn the page and it'll be this big full page expanse. And there's just something so effective about that, of like the tiny and the big, and like our place in all of that, like the as within so without sort of feeling I get. I don't know, I really like it. And I love too how even though most of the book is in black and white and like the detail is beautiful, we get quite a lot of pages that are in full color as well, and they're so pretty. I think there are a few things though that made this book not work quite as well for me as Furari did. I think the first one, and one of the big differences, is that this is set in sort of modern times. It's very contemporary. This is like an urban environment, whereas Furari was set in the Edo period. I don't think that relates so much to why I did or didn't like it, but it was probably one of the main differences. The other big difference is that in Furari, there's like a magical realism element. Where the main character, I don't know whether he's seeing beyond the veil or he's like astral traveling or projecting, or he's just got a very like lively imagination. But there's elements of the book that sort of take it beyond the mundane into like that magical realm. In this book, we don't get any of that. Like the magical realism is gone. There is still like a focus on the mundane and like drawing meaning and beauty from the mundane, but like not that next layer of magical realism. And that is something that I found very charming and appealing in Furari, and I did miss it here. I think though the main thing that made it less enjoyable for me was just like the dynamic between the husband and the wife in this book. In Furari, there is a husband and a wife, and although like he goes off on his little wanderings and she's like at home working, doing the housework sort of stuff, there was still like quite a tender dynamic between the two. Whereas in this, it more feels like the unhappy housewife has to stay at home while her husband goes off exploring for himself and comes home late every night because he's off daydreaming and having a great time. I don't know. So I suppose that dynamic just felt less charming and appealing to me. And I think maybe the framing too from the author that this like mindful walking is something we should be aspiring to. But then it didn't feel like there was a whole lot of self-awareness, I suppose, of like, there's a lot of privilege in that situation in of itself, like the free time that the main character has to be able to indulge in that the wife isn't afforded. There's also two like extra stories at the end that I'm not really sure how connected they're supposed to be to the whole story. They feel quite separate, so I'm considering them as like little bonus things. But anyway, I don't know. This was just nice. Like the artwork is really what holds this together, and I do enjoy just the small slice of life wandering thing that it's got going, but it didn't have the charm that Furari did. Next, we've got my Blossom Book Club book for the month, which was Rev A Witch by Kellyanne Maddox. Now, I am like a super fan of Kellyanne and have been for like 8 years at this point. So I am finding it very hard to like review or talk about this book at all. Additionally, I will also say that I am not a witch. I don't identify as a witch, but I have also read a lot of other 101 witchcraft and pagan books. I know that might sound a little bit strange, but like I work in an esoteric bookshop. I'm part of the tarot, pagan, old spirituality community. So I've read quite a lot of those books. So basically what I'm saying is I am not the target audience for this book. And basically in this book, Kellyanne just goes over as many different elements of witchcraft that you will come into contact with on your journey. Gives you a bit of an introduction or an overview to those things, but then also with the caveat, always with the caveat that what you do in your practice is your own choice. It's up to you to carve out your own path. She does also occasionally provide like little hints into ways that she has practiced, but this is not like a how Kellyanne practices. This is a permission slip to new witches to really explore and like take charge in their own path and make their path their own. One of the things that I loved about this book was how inclusive the language was. Right from the beginning, Kellyanne is making it very clear that she wants this book to be as accessible and inclusive as possible. She doesn't make assumptions about who the reader is, what their abilities or disabilities might be, what their access to tools might be, all of that sort of stuff. She also is very deliberate about avoiding like gendered language, which I really appreciate. Kellyanne's writing style too is just very, very easy to read. And I really like at the end of each chapter, we have a write it and try it section where she gives you sort of like some journal prompts or suggestions of things that you can try out for yourself to experiment. I also liked that she included like a section on ethics in witchcraft. I don't feel like it was very well fleshed out. I mean, this is a pretty small book and like it covers a lot of ground. But for me, some of the topics just felt like, I don't know, while I was glad she included them, I was disappointed with the way they were handled. I didn't really feel like they went far enough. And I also sort of feel like sometimes like the ethos of the book of like your path is your own, you make it your own, you have permission to experiment and explore and do what you want. I think sometimes that was preferenced a bit too much, especially when it came to like some really important, significant topics like the ethics around like cultural appropriation, for example. And whilst Kellyanne did, you know, touch on those subjects and there was a few questions for us to consider when we come into contact with those situations, I don't know, to me, I did feel like the "but do whatever you want" went a little bit too far in those circumstances, especially given that like this book didn't really have the scope to flesh out how and why things like cultural appropriation are harmful. And it's not just really a personal choice when we're impacting on other people. And then there was a few other little complaints I had, like for example, one was the Sabbats. She kind of gave a nice breakdown of the Sabbats, which I think was really helpful and clear. But as someone in the Southern Hemisphere, I was a little frustrated to see that the Southern Hemisphere dates weren't included. There wasn't even like a reminder that the dates are different in the Southern Hemisphere. We're the opposite. That happens a lot in these sort of books, but every time I see it, like especially with how inclusive and open the book is trying to be, to sort of then like just forget about the bottom half of the world is a little sad. So a good complementary book, I think, for a beginner witch or someone who's interested in witchcraft. And it certainly does cover quite a lot for 250 pages. Just keep in mind that it definitely doesn't go as deep on some topics as I think it could have or should have. But it's great for an overview of a lot of different topics that you'll come into contact with when you're getting into witchcraft. Anyway, like I said, I'm not the target audience for this book, but I enjoyed my reading experience well enough, and I just wanted to support Kellyanne, and I was curious to see, what she'd done putting a book together. That's just a really cool thing. Okay, now for the 4-star books. First, let's talk about 100 Days by Alice Pung. My first Alice Pung, finally. Alice is a local author to me. She sort of is from my area, and I've wanted to read her for a long time. This is her new release. It came out just like, I think about 6 weeks ago. This is the story of a 16-year-old girl called Karuna, and I think from memory it's set in the 90s or thereabouts, and it's set in like my area of the inner west of Melbourne. And basically Karuna is a young girl sort of struggling with the pressures of high school and being a teenager, as everybody is, but she's also like, her home life is quite specific. Karuna's mother is ethnically Chinese from memory, but she was living in the Philippines, and then she emigrated to Australia to marry Karuna's father, who is a white Australian man. So Karuna's life is complicated by that interesting tension of being biracial, of being of two cultures, of trying to assimilate more or less is what she's really wanting to do, I think. Her father is a bit distant, a bit hands-off, which has its own problems, obviously, but the book much more centers on Karuna's relationship with her mother. And her mother's quite an overbearing character. And the book is told from Karuna's perspective, but she's talking to her child because basically she's fallen pregnant, and she is telling her life story and sort of like what's happening to her baby. When her mother finds out she's pregnant, her overbearing nature becomes much more controlling, to the point where it becomes abuse, essentially. So it's not an enjoyable book to read. It's very uncomfortable, but the way that Alice Pung has like captured the atmosphere of that, it felt so claustrophobic. Like you felt it in your body. It was uncomfortable to read, and I just think it was brilliantly done. And Karuna's character was just such a compelling one. It's a story about power and love and control and family, and how all of these things sort of like conflict and make life complicated. And it's really quite a quick read. It's not a very long book. It's only like 200 pages or so, 250 pages. But at least for me, I found like I wanted to get through it quite quickly because it was so uncomfortable. I didn't want to sit in it, basically. But I think the experience was definitely worthwhile. It was really well done. Then a tarot book. I actually read a tarot book. I haven't read a tarot book from cover to cover in a long time. For those of you who don't know, this is my second channel. I have a main channel, which is primarily a tarot channel. I do some bookish content over there too. I recently did a collab video where Sammy Menzo, who is an astrologer, and I recommended books for star signs. So if you're into that, you might like that channel too. So I love tarot. I've been reading tarot for maybe 8 years or so. I just don't read a lot of tarot books anymore, but I did read the activity book by Andy Matzner this month. And this is not a typical tarot book. Like we don't get like a write-up of what each card means. We don't get suggested spreads. We don't get a discussion of the history of tarot, any of that. Instead, this really just dives straight into different activities that we can use tarot for. And this very much aligns with like my own journey with tarot. I mean, obviously like I can and sometimes do more like predictive readings, but not really, not often. I tend to use tarot much more for myself, for my mental well-being, for like self-exploration, as like a way to brainstorm or problem solve, that sort of stuff. So I really enjoyed this book. Andy is a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and tarot reader. And this book is separated up into 3 main sections. There's conversation starters, writing and journaling, and arts and crafts. And yes, arts and crafts does involve cutting up tarot cards sometimes. And I went through and just like flagged all of the different activities that I was interested in and that I would like to try in future. And there's a really great array and variety of different sorts of exercises that you can do that Andy offers. A lot of them involve consciously working with tarot. So that's when we, you know, don't shuffle and draw random cards. Instead, we turn the cards face up and like decide what cards we want to work with. Usually in response to a particular prompt or to, you know, represent a certain feeling that we're having or represent a certain problem that we're experiencing, something like that. I did feel at times that this was a little repetitive. I do feel like some of the activities were pretty similar and maybe could have done with a bit of editing down, but I mean, you do get almost 100 different activities and there is a great variety. So overall, I was really, really happy that I finally got around to reading this book, and I can't wait to go through some of these exercises. I think books like this just get us, you know, out of our box with working with tarot and get us exploring the cards in new ways and our own experience with the cards in different ways, which I really appreciate. Now for my 5-star read. There's just one of those this month, and it is the hefty Carpentaria by Alexis Wright. I cannot believe I finally read this book. This did come to me in the Wild Book Box. I know it's been a little while since I uploaded my last Wild Book Box vlog. That is because all of the books were huge and it's taken me a while to get through them. But I will be talking to you more about my experience reading this book in that upcoming vlog. This is one of those books that I have always wanted to read. I've seen it on the shelves at bookshops, I've seen it online, and just always thought I would love to read that one day. But you know my big book fear. Every time I see this book and think, I'd like to read that one day, I back out. I back out pretty quickly. So receiving it in the Wild Book Box was a great push to finally get around to it. Now, I will say that this is not an easy book to read. Obviously, it's quite long. It's over 500 pages, but like even then, the text is quite small. Like it's a long read, but on top of that, it is dense. And it's also just very unconventional. So for me, I found that I took 2 to 3 times longer to read this than I would normally expect for a book of this length. It's also really quite dark in a lot of ways. There's a lot of really heavy content, a lot of trigger warnings. For example, there is explicit on-page abuse of a disabled person. There's explicit on-page hate crimes, deaths in custody, all of that sort of stuff. It's really intense and there's no getting around that. Having said that, this is also some of the most beautiful writing I've ever read, and it just feels unlike anything else I've ever read. This feels like the ultimate Australian epic. This feels like mythology. It feels like a story that exists outside and beyond time and space. I don't know. Even though it is very rooted in time and place, like we are very much in a small town in northern Queensland, it's very much a story about poverty and colonization and family. But I think the characters themselves, they feel so big. They feel so larger than life, and like the animism that's like inherent in this book and the characters' experience as well, and how alive the ancestors are. I don't know, to me there was just such a strong awareness that even the characters that are alive in this book are ancestors too, and in that way it felt beyond time. It felt so much bigger than it really was. Ultimately it felt like allegory, I suppose, and it felt like even though we were talking about the small town of Desperance, we weren't only talking about the small town of Desperance. And at the end of it, I got a very strong, clear message that I don't know how to talk about without spoiling the book. And I also feel like maybe other people will have a different experience. But to me, this is a story of tragedy and trauma and resilience. I've just never read anything like it. And I think it's one of the greatest books I've ever read. And I'm just like in awe of Alexis Wright. I just loved it. I don't know, I could talk on and on about this book and still never feel like I've captured what I want to say. Hopefully I will be able to explore it a little bit more in that vlog with you that will be coming soon. So those are the 6 books I managed to read in the month of August. I would love to hear in the comments below what you got around to reading this month and if you'd recommend anything. And until next time, so much love. Bye.